Hey guys, Mr. G here. In this video, we're just going to do a short review on graphing sine of x and cosine of x. All right. Now, for the first example, let's start with graphing a specific sine function, which is 3 times sine of 2x plus 2 pi over 3 plus 1. All right. Now, before I graph, I got to figure out what number represents A, B, C, and D. All right, so we have all the formulas that we need to help us make a graph. All right, so let's go ahead and figure out my letters. So I have A, B, C, and then D. So if we take a look at A, we see that 3 is in the same spot as A, so A is going to be 3. And then for B, we see that 2 is in the same spot for B, so B is 2. Then C, we have plus 2 pi over 3, and originally the C was a negative. So to go from a negative to a positive, this has to be a negative. So C is going to be a negative 2 pi over 3. And then for D, we see we have 1 in the same spot as D, so D is going to be 1. All right, so now I can go ahead and figure out the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, quarters, all those informations. So let's go ahead and get started with the amplitude. Now with the amplitude, you just take the absolute value of whatever A is. So if we take the absolute value of 3, we still get 3. So the amplitude, which is the height of the graph from the midline to the max or the min, is 3 units. All right, so now let's go ahead and figure out the period. Okay, so with the period, we're gonna take 2 pi or 360 and then divide it by B, which is 2. And if I were to simplify this, 2 divided by 2 becomes 1, so we just get 1 pi. All right, so the period for this graph is gonna be pi. All right, so then let's go ahead and figure out the quarters. So with the quarters, we're gonna take what we've had for the period, which is pi, all right, period, and then divide that by 4. This can't be simplified any further. So my quarter is pi over 4 radians or 45 degrees. Okay, so let's go ahead and figure out the phase shift. So we have a phase shift. All right, so with the phase shift, we're gonna take my value for C, which is negative 2 pi over 3. And then we're going to divide that by B, which is 2. So we have a radian, which is set up as a fraction, divided by a whole number. So for this one, we're going to have to do the keep, change, flip. So I'm going to keep this fraction, the first fraction, change this into a multiplication, and flip this to as a 1 over 2. And if I were to cross simplify, the 2's go away. Negative pi times 1 is negative pi. 3 times 1 is 3. So I get negative pi over 3. Now remember, phase shift follow the same rule as a horizontal shift. So if we're going negative pi over 3 horizontally, that means we're either going to the left or to the right. So with that being said, the left side represents the negative. So we're going to be moving pi over 3 or 60 degrees to the left. Okay, so now we just have one more, which we got to figure out the midline, the max line, and the min line. All right, so let's go ahead and figure out those things. So we have mid, max, and min. Okay, so usually with the mid, I take whatever my value for D is, and that's going to be my midline. So we have y equals to 1. So all of my points that are on the midline are going to be at y equals to 1. And then we have the max, which I take D and A and add them together. So I should get y equals to 4. And then I have my min, which I take D minus A, 1 minus 3. That's going to give me negative 2. All right. Okay, so we got all of our information. So now we're going to go ahead and make my graph. All right. So I'm just gonna do it down here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 3, 2, 1. -2, and then draw the lines. The max line, the midline, and the min line. Okay? And then we're gonna figure out the x values. All right? So in reality, all we really need are 5 numbers. Let me just move this up a bit. Okay? So if we take a look, we usually start at 0, 0 for any graph, whether it's sine or cosine. However, we do have a phase shift which is -pi/3. So that means that instead of starting at 0, 0, I'm actually going to start at -pi/3, or which is -60 degrees. All right, and then I usually would start at 0, 0, which is the midpoint of the sine function. So for this one, all of my midpoints are going to be at 1. So I'm going to be starting off at -pi/3, 1. Now remember, we have the pattern for the sine graph, which goes mid, max, mid, min, mid. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to figure out, well, what is the next x? What's going to be the second x value that's going to be my max? Well, we have our starting radian, which is -pi/3, and our quarter to go from one x value to the next is pi/4. So all I need to do is just add this to pi/4. So what I can do is just add the fraction. So -pi/3, which can be written as -1/3. Add that to -1/4. All right. Oh, +1/4, my bad. And that's going to give me -1/12. So we're still on the left side of the x-axis, so -pi/12. All right. So that means that at this point, that's going to be my max. All right. And then we have our third x value, which is going to be my mid. So I have -1/12 or -pi/12. So I'm just going to write 1/12 in my calculator. Add that to 1/4. And that's going to give me 1/6. So my third x value is 1/6 or pi/6. All right, so then we're going back to mid. And then we have our fourth x value. So I'm going to take 1/6 for pi/6, add that to 1/4. And that's going to give me 5 pi/12. All right, and that's going to be my min. And then we have the fifth and final number. I'm going to add that to, so I have 5/12 plus 1/4. And that gives me 2/3. So 2 pi/3 and back to my mid. All right, so I have my graph. All right, we start at mid, then max, mid, then min, then mid. All right, if you guys recall for cosine, we have max, mid, min, mid, max. All right, so now for the rest of the review, we're just going to be looking at some questions based on the type of function that we're given. Like number 2, where we got to figure out what is the max for this specific function. All right. So if we take a look, we got to figure out what is going to be the maximum y values for this specific function. And to figure out the maximum, we just need 2 numbers, which are numbers for A and D. So if we take a look, we see that 7 is in the same spot as A. There is no parentheses going on behind cosine. So there's no number so the coefficient for B would be 1, and then there's no C, but we just need A and D. So we have 7 for A, and then we see that 5 is in the same spot as D, so I just need 7 and 5 to figure out the max. All right, so to figure out the max, I have D plus A. So D is 5 plus 7. So Y equals to 5 plus 7. And I get 12. So that means that all the maximum points for this specific graph is going to be at Y equals to 12. All right, now the third question we have, what is the amplitude of Y equals to negative 3 times cosine of X? So for this one, all we just need is we need to take this, whatever value is A, and we see that negative 3 is in the same spot as A, all right? However, for the amplitude, that represents the measurement. And remember, we can't have negative measurements. So to figure out the amplitude, I'm gonna take the absolute value of negative 3. And once we do that, that becomes a positive 3. So the amplitude is gonna be 3 units for this specific graph, all right? Moving on, identify the period. For this specific function, let me move it down. We have 3 times sine of 2 pi, 2/3, 2 over 3x, all right? So let's go ahead and figure out the period. So the period, you just need to take 2 pi and divide it by whatever b is. And if we take a look, we see that 2/3 is in the same spot as b, which is in front of, which is a coefficient for x. So that means that b is going to be 2/3. And if we take a look, we have a whole number in radians divided by a fraction. So this is where we need to do the keep, change, flip. I keep this how it is, so 2 pi, change this and change the division to a multiplication, and then flip the fraction, 3 over 2. All right, I can go ahead and cross simplify, so this becomes a 1, this becomes a 1. 1 pi times 3 is 3 pi. And then we have 1 times 1, which is 1. So we have 3 over 1, which is still 3 pi. So the period is, for number 4, is 3 pi. All right, guys, so let's look at number 5, which we got to figure out the midline for y of negative 2 plus sine of 3x minus pi over 4. All right? So let's go ahead and figure out the midline. Let me just put it down here. Let me put it right here. Actually, right here is better. Okay. So to figure out the midline, we always need to figure out the midline, we just figure out what number is in the same spot as D. And to figure that out, we need to have it in this format where we have the sine of a specific function first, and then we have the number. So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite it as sine of 3x minus pi over 4 minus 2, all right? So all I did for this was just bring the 2 all the way to the back. So now that I'll be able to figure out what is the value that's in the same spot as D for the midline, all right? And we see that negative 2. So for the midline, we have y is equal to negative 2, all right? So now we have number 6. What's the minimum? And what is the minimum for this specific function? So we have y equals to 3 times cosine of 4x plus 5 pi over 4 minus 1. And to figure out the min, all I need to do is take my numbers for D and A and subtract them. So if we take a look, we see that negative 1 is in the same spot as D. So negative 1. And then 3 is in the same spot as A. And to figure that out, I just subtract these two, and I get negative 4. So my min would be y equals to negative 4. Okay, now for number 7. If we take a look, we see what is the distance between each point for this specific function. Now when they're talking about what is the distance, they want to figure out the quarter. How do we get from one x to the next? Now this is going to be a 2-step process, because first what we got to do is figure out the period. So for the period, we gotta take 2 pi and divide it by my value for b, which in this case is 2. All right. So we have 2 pi divided by 2, which simplifies into a pi. And then to figure out the quarters, all you're gonna do is you're gonna take the period, which is pi, divide that by 4. It can't be further simplified, so my quarters is pi over 4. Now for number 8, which of the following represents y equals to negative cosine of x? All right, so we have 4 options. Now with cosine of x,
it's just usually a U shape, all right? So, whereas opposed with these two represent sine of x. So we're left with C or D. Now with cosine, the pattern would go from max to mid to min to mid, then max. And then we have a negative in the front. So with the negative in the front, that's gonna do a specific kind of transformation, which is reflect across the x-axis. So in this case, we have C that's reflected across the x-axis. Because if I were to graph the original cosine, it would look something like this. And we see that from the original graph to the new graph, it's reflected across the x-axis. So C is definitely my answer. Now let's take a look at number 9. Now for number 9, we have the specific function, and we got to figure out the amplitude, the phase shift, and the period. Move this a little over here. All right, so the first thing we got to figure out the amplitude. What is the height from the midline to the max or the min? And if we take a look at the two, we see that from midline to max, it's going 3 units, and then from the midline to the min, it's also going 3 units. So my amplitude is going to be 3 units. Then we have the phase shift. Now to figure out the phase shift, what we can do is we can start at the origin, 0, 0, and see how much did that point move to the first point that's on the graph. So we went from 0 to pi over 4. So with that shift would be pi over 4 to the right. All right? Because if you take a look, instead of starting at 0, 0 for my sine function, I start at pi over 4. Now the reason this is a graph for a sine function because of the pattern. We go from mid to max, mid, min, mid. All right? Now let's figure out the period. Now the period, we usually see what is the last number, which is 5 pi over 4. But if we recall, we see that the graph has a phase shift of pi over 4 units to the right. So to figure out the period, I can work my way backwards. So I'm going to take the last radian, 5 pi over 4, and subtract it to pi over 4. And then that's going to give me 4 pi over 4, which is pi. So the period is going to be pi radians. All right, hope this video helped. Have a wonderful day.